Cool. I think we're good. We'll get rolling and then see if anyone else jumps in over time. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining today. We have another fun Atomic Friday. This will be recorded and we will have this shipped out in either the Slack group or via email to everybody. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box and we'll try to answer them live or follow up afterwards as well. So today, Atomic Friday, we're talking about AMSI from a defender's perspective. This should be really great. I have a good friend joining today. I got Jimmy from Carbon Black. And Jim, go ahead and probably halfway introduced yourself.
Yeah, I'll just do a quick one. So I've been at Carbon Black for 3 years now, and I oversee sort of our applied research here. And so we own all the detections in the products. And so excited to join Mike and talk about all this neat AMSI stuff.
Awesome. So kind of why AMSI, right? Like why PowerShell's dead? Why are we still talking about AMSI today? And we found, I think it was last week, this came out from Microsoft on their recent like our blog post. And we shared it with you, Jimmy, and you shared it with me, and we were all jumping over this one. And just with just how much is involved, right? And from delivery to final stage here. But
and I was gonna say, I know internally this got a lot of momentum within our threat research team, and you know, you hear a lot, right? And I think it's all about sort of where you hear that news from. But PowerShell is still alive and well. Attackers are still using it because guess what? It just works, and they're lazy, right? And they just want to kind of use things that work. And you know, when you think about PowerShell's execution from a defender's perspective, the sort of only telemetry that we have, right, is sort of external observations of, you know, PowerShell was invoked by this process, parent-child, command lines, right? But that's not enough these days, right? It's just not enough. You can call PowerShell without calling process names, right? And at that point, you're dead in the water. And so, you know, we have these things like AMSI and PowerShell script block logging, right, that allow us to gain much better telemetry, right, on these executions. And as this slide clearly points out, it gives defenders a better chance, right? It gives us more telemetry, which means we have a better chance of finding evil and preventing evil. And sort of, you know, back of the napkin math, right? I'm looking at this diagram over here on the right. There's like 7 or 8 places where, as a defender, you would get information from PowerShell script block logging, Sysmon, or AMSI, right? And you know, that's awesome, right? And that right there kind of shows its value. And I think actually Microsoft even had a post that showed for their detections and their products where they were pulling their telemetry from, and a vast majority of that came from AMSI.
Yeah, and I think I'm quickly counted like 5 or 6 PowerShells in here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And this particular sample had dropped in, I think they had brought in Node, right? So it's called Node or SOC.
Yep, and it gets the buzzwords for living off the land, right?
Yeah.
But this one was also very heavy on JavaScript, right? And so JavaScript is interpreted by command interpreter. I believe it's C script, right? And that is also hooked by AMSI, right? So you're getting very valuable insights into those executions.
Yeah, you got your multiple angles happening here. Pretty interesting. Yeah. So it's not dead. PowerShell's still being actively used.
Yeah, and I think this was just just happened to kind of show up, and I was like, oh, I'm totally pulling this in because this helps prove the point, right?
Yeah, exactly. And where AMSI can at least be used, right? Be used by defenders and be used more. And so, yeah, man. Let's see what we got here. Oh, can't click. Yeah, so, and one thing too we wanted to highlight was Red Canary released the threat detection report earlier this year, I believe. And this in particular went through all of Red Canary's detections, highlighting all the types of just the data that we have internally. And the one that still stands out, right, even to this year, is PowerShell for us was our number one. And so there's still a lot to there's still a lot going on with PowerShell, whether red teams or penetration testers are moving away from using PowerShell. We're still seeing it used even just like in the commodity space, or even just like the repurposed testing or whatnot. It's still out there to this day. And I think, Jimmy, you called this out too, like PowerShell's being used to, you can still find those behaviors of reg surf spawning from it, run DLL, registry modifications coming out of it and whatnot.
Yeah,
with PowerShell.
I would guess if you were to like dig into your data a little bit more, I would be like the correlations, right, between, the run DLL, masquerading, reg serve, typically those kick off something that then runs PowerShell and downloads other stuff and injects shellcode and all that happy stuff.
Yeah. You'll see those spawns off of it, and batch file running 6 more things, and
Yeah, so is it run DLL running without any command line parameters, right? That kind of stuff.
Yep. We did have one question here, and it was actually right along the lines, and we'll probably cover it, but I'll ask it just so it's top of mind. Does AMSI log events even if we are not running Windows Defender? So in particular, still interested in seeing like the batch scripts VB PowerShell, for example.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's a good segue into the next slide if you want.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I promise I will answer that question and sort of pull it all together with this slide. So anti-malware scanning interface, right? It's an acronym. That's why we're talking AMSI here. And this is a diagram that Microsoft put out when they were introducing AMSI to the world, and I think it to this day still does a really good job of just sort of at a high level describing how it works, right? And so I drew this red box around this specific piece in the diagram because as a defender, this is all that you really need to care about, and really in reality what you have control over. And so to answer that, to answer that first question, you see that there's that AV provider layer, right? That's the kernel, and everything above that is user space. So an AMSI runs in user space as a DLL that gets loaded into an eligible process, right? And those eligible processes are up on the top, like be PowerShell, VB script, C script, UAC, even a lot of the macro stuff and Office docs are all hooked and as part of an AMSI inspection. And you see that little box around the third-party AV provider class. So Microsoft provides provides APIs so that any third-party anti-malware provider can create a DLL, register it in Windows as an AMSI provider, and then sort of also benefit from all the same data. It's actually, if you're part of their Microsoft, developer program, it's one of the things that they sort of strive to get you to incorporate with. It's like a checkbox and part of the process. But what are some other sort of interesting callouts here in this diagram? User space, right? I think as defenders, we always think kernel mode versus user mode, and like, oh, kernel mode is always better. And the reality is like, sure, it can be the most trusted place, right? Because at the end of the day, the conversation's around trust. And when things are in user space, they can be tampered with admin rights, right? And so, the sort of bulk of this talk, right, is creating atomic tests to detect AMSI bypasses, right? And so one would think, well, why doesn't Microsoft just fix it? Why don't they just make it so it can't be bypassed? And they can't, right? And it's by design that's that way, right? And so as a defender, we sort of need to ensure that we're hardened against these bypasses and that we can sort of detect as much as we can. It's sort of a chicken and the egg, right? You got to get code execution before you can bypass. And so we can sort of use that as a sort of another indicator to detect these evil things. And just to geek out a little bit, right, you have this AMSI.dll, and that is the DLL that provides all of the interfaces and functions into AMSI. And so if you were to launch PowerShell on your machine, and you were to look with like something like Procmon or Sysmon, you would see that AMSI DLL being loaded as part of that process execution into that process. And so the sort of two main functions that are provided in that DLL that you'll typically see in these bypasses are this AMSI scan buffer and AMSI scan string. And the scan buffer and scan string are sort of probably two of the most important ones that are provided as part of this AMSI DLL. And that's what actually gives us all that rich data and allows us to build detections off of and build preventions off of.
And because it's a DLL living in user, I know we'll get into it later, but it provides opportunity for, does it provide opportunity for actors, adversaries, whomever to modify this or mess with this DLL?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a really good question, right? And the answer is yes. So if you have admin rights and above, if you're familiar with process injection, right, and the techniques around process injection and how that works, that's what you will see for some of these AMSI bypasses, where you can call some Windows 32 APIs, like get proc address on that AMSI.dll to see where that DLL is living in memory. Then you can sort of call different Windows APIs related to like virtual protect, right, which would essentially tell you to mark that section of memory as writable. And then as a bad guy, you can essentially take your hex and just write that hex right into those memory addresses with something that you would look ahead with something like IDA to figure out where in memory you'd want to modify, and then you would write that patch in there. And then AMSI would in that process from there on out would be disabled. And that's an interesting point, is when you disable AMSI, it's not like a global operating system thing. It's only for that process that you're living in.
Oh, gotcha. That's interesting. Yeah. Cool, man. Cool. I'm going to jump ahead and then we can look at this guy.
Let's do it. So, we're here talking about a defender's perspective in AMSI. And as when you talk about purple teaming, right? I think it's very important to have an attacker's perspective, because until you understand what attackers are doing as a defender, you won't know how to defend against it, right? And so, internally at CB, we've been researching this AMSI stuff for a while, for probably about 6 months now. And so I thought I would kind of bucket what I thought were the common techniques that attackers, red teamers, et cetera, are using today in the wild, and kind of go through those at a high level and sort of how you would see those, right? And so the first one is patching the currently loaded DLL in memory, and that's what you're seeing over on the right. And you're seeing load library, get proc address, virtual protect, right? You should never see your PowerShell scripts containing those strings in them. I can tell you that. It has a very similar sort of signature behavior to process injection. And that's because it's in a way doing it right, without sort of injecting a DLL or something into a process. But it's not prevalently used. However, this technique, and we'll get into a little bit, is one of the most common one that's packaged into other sort of third-party attacker platforms. So another one that we see is modifying the registry. And so this is where we get into, you don't need to have AMSI to actually detect these types of attacks, right? And so there are a couple places in the registry where you need to register your AMSI provider with the operating system. And there's like a unique GUID that's associated with every AMSI provider. And that's an HKey local machine. And you can, if with admin rights, right, you could just delete that. And when that process goes to run, it's not going to think that there's any registered providers, and AMSI isn't going to initialize and inspect your stuff. There's also some HKey current user registry keys, so you don't need admin rights to modify those. And those are specific to C script and W script and so that J script inspection. And so that's another place where you should be monitoring those registry keys, right, to make sure no one's tampering with them. Everyone's favorite, DLL and executable planting / search order hijacking. So when PowerShell goes to pick on PowerShell, when it goes to execute, it does the typical Windows binary sort of search order, looking for that binary or for that DLL, right? And so the first thing it does is it looks, in its current working directory to see if AMSI.dll exists. And if it doesn't, it follows the typical Windows binary search path, order to find that DLL until it's finally found and loaded into the process. So what bad guys will do is they'll sort of drop down their own version of PowerShell, or they'll just copy one from the current directory, right? Put it in a user writable directory. And then they'll also take their sort of malicious or benign, but broken AMSI DLL and plop it right next to that, PowerShell version. And so when they go to execute it, it will load that DLL right next to it. And that DLL is either a dummy DLL, stub.dll, etc. And AMSI will never execute, right? Or never initialize. And then finally, like there's some really simple ones where you're really not even mucking with AMSI at all. You're kind of just going around it, right? And so you can, when you launch PowerShell, right, you can say dash v2 on the command line or dash version v2, and it will downgrade that PowerShell session to that older version, right? And so that's before AMSI's time, right? And so AMSI doesn't inspect PowerShell v2 executions. However, that's a really easy sort of indicator to look for in your command line executions. And then finally, everyone's favorite, invoke obfuscation, right? With all the different crazy ways that you can pass, obfuscated command lines to PowerShell. To me, it's honestly a work of art, just how well that works. Yeah. But yes, that still will bypass AMSI as well, right? Especially if you're doing things with environment variables, because AMSI won't resolve those environment variables, right? So you'll still just see this really kooky, command line. But at that point, sort of one of the benefits you get from AMSI is you can infer the length of that command line. And we all know that these obfuscated command line strings are really, really long, and it's usually a good indicator of something evil's happening.
Yep.
And one last thing, I wanted to give a shout out to this link at the bottom. It's actually really good. It does a good job of, it's sort of like an atomic red team in one for a lot of these AMSI bypasses. And so I highly recommend that you check that out and kind of see, at least look at the source and to sort of understand what's going on, how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Thanks. Of these, so as a defender, if I'm looking at, without even looking at like Atomic Red Team's test, like if I saw these 5 things, like as we see on the screen here, what are you finding as like the most prominent one like being used out there today?
Yeah, without a doubt, it's that bottom one, the T1027, the string obfuscation. We see that all the time. Bad guys. It's just like I said, it's just so easy. And the community has done such a good job of like packaging these things up and putting them on GitHub that the barrier to entry for less sophisticated adversaries is so low. But it also allows bad guys to bypass your pre-execution and detection technologies on your endpoints, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think the one that I've been seeing slightly a little bit more and more, even being used by like malware, is like T1038, the search order hijacking now.
Yeah, yep, I agree. And actually, I think we were talking about this, like a week ago or something, but it's, once you see these things like being weaponized, and I put that in quotes, right? When something's weaponized, it's up on GitHub in some script that you can copy and paste, right? I think you start to see the adversaries pick these up and start to put them in their repertoire and use them in the wild. But yeah, I agree. And it's so easy, right? And you don't need, and it's actually not nearly as loud, right? In terms of like the Windows 32 API calls, right? Patching currently loaded stuff in memory, that means you're calling into the .NET subsystem from PowerShell. That alone is really sketchy, right? And so something like constrained language mode, which you can enforce via group policy, will completely prevent that from happening, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. Bypasses in the wild.
Yeah, scary. It's like we're at the zoo.
But I know.
Really. Yeah, so I thought to sort of, to quantify, right? To say, all right, is this really scary? Do we really need to care about these things, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of like this risk versus reward. And, they are alive and well, right? We know PowerShell is alive and well in the wild from an attacker perspective. And yes, it's also heavily used in a lot of the popular sort of frameworks that we see. If you go on the MITRE ATT&CKs, threat intel wiki, you don't really see a lot of shout outs to AMSI. I think there's one related to Turla about a year ago, and they use the patching scan buffer bypass where they had a base64 encoded DLL inside of their PowerShell script. They load that DLL up via reflection to assembly.load, and that DLL is specifically programmed to, once it's executed, to disable or to patch the scan buffer, make it seem like it's not there, and continue executing. But everyone's favorite C2 frameworks, right? Cobalt Strike, Empire, Covenant, Silent Trinity. I think these are some of the most popular ones that are out there. If you just go to their GitHub repos and search for AMSI, you'll see sort of just the code that they use, except for Cobalt Strike. But you'll see the code that they're using to bypass AMSI. And then these payload generation frameworks, right? Like these are like your like download cradles, first stage kind of tools. And so Trusted Sex Unicorn, that's a really good tool. Sharpshooter, PS Attack, and obviously Invoke Obfuscation is the other one. And Invoke Obfuscation is built into Empire as well, right? And then finally, I thought this one was like the most elegant thing I've seen in a while. Is this GitHub repo is Cobber. I'm probably butchering that, sorry. And it's called PS AMSI. And this person did an awesome job of leveraging PowerShell and sort of in-memory tricks to hook these AMSI functions. And so essentially what you can do at a high level is take a directory. So if you're a red team or an attacker, and you develop all your code and it's all based on PowerShell, you can put it all in a directory and run this. And it will essentially like pass those scripts on to Windows Defender to see if it fires a signature, right? So you're sort of black box testing Windows Defender to see if it fires off any signatures, right? So it's awesome. Like I think this is really cool. And from a defender's perspective, I think it's super useful too, right? Because you get to kind of see, it's codified on how like an attacker's mind works. And so this also sort of exposes ways for you to modify. So say it does fire a signature, it also allows you to be like, hey, if you run it this way, you'll get right by that signature, right? So it's certainly the cat and mouse.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's one thing I need to check out. That seems like a pretty neat. I remember looking at the code, but yeah, I just got to run it.
Agree.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. Like even as more and more of these frameworks, the C2 frameworks themselves become, I don't know, more and more mature, and it's interesting. There's just so many functions and features, and even in like Cobalt and Covenant and Silent Trinity, and I think I don't know. I'm just thinking about like maturity of actors actually using some of these functions, right? Because things are just so simple to point and click a few things, hit a couple keys, and I got enough to just bypass enough things, right? But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's certainly scary, right?
Yeah.
And I see that there's a question here.
Oh,
related to POSH attacks, open source reverse proxy tunnels for C2. Yeah, absolutely. You see a lot of that, right? What is it? Stunnel is one of them, and I think Mike, you and Casey were playing around with one too, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because we did talk about this on the Connection Proxy Atomic Friday. We go into ngrok and I think it was Tunnel Me or something like that. But yeah, yep, they're I guess as far as in the wild, I think we talked about it before in the past that yeah, there's definitely, they are being used in the wild for sure. I think a couple of them have been commoditized. They're not widely commoditized yet. I think Casey and I had a little discussion related to if it can be tied into ngrok is a popular one for sure. I think we had a discussion about them being kind of tied into how domain fronting, because in a way it's a form of domain fronting, but it's not domain fronting itself where you're trying to hide it across like different things. But using a reverse proxy like ngrok and kind of like hosting it does look very shady on a machine. Hitting an ngrok.io domain, yeah, those are things, right, that as defenders, if you're looking for fishy looking C2 channels, looking at those are very interesting. I don't think there's enough information out there on them, but I think for who had asked that question, definitely check out that Connection Proxy Atomic Friday, where we did have some pretty solid details on that. And Casey went into I think Casey had a demo on that one too, using ngrok as a reverse proxy with PowerShell. And maybe something else too, maybe MSHTA.
Yeah, they're right. And that's when you're talking about sort of from an attacker's perspective, they're trying to get around, the network monitoring, proxies, next gen firewalls, right? All that stuff. And typically those tools have like a shelf life of, once someone blogs about them, every network security vendor under the sun SIGs them, and then they're burned, right? And I think right now I haven't seen a lot of people talk about that, so I'm sure they're kind of flying under the radar.
Yep.
So it's up to us to
Yeah.
do their due diligence.
Yeah. A super yeah, it's a super interesting way to bypass, right? Because I think even ngrok uses Amazon IPs, so it gets kind of sketchy. And but yeah, it's interesting for sure. Good one there. Yeah, kind of changing gears to atomic tests at that point. We've had there's been a lot of atomic ads lately, and I think on the last Atomic Friday we talked about Invoke Atomic Red Team, the PowerShell Invoke Atomic Red Team, and there's been some great ads from Carrie and her team over there. But when it comes to PowerShell, I think we've had a few of these in the past, right, Jimmy?
Yep.
As far as AMSI ones, yeah. So I think they've kind of been in here. But yeah, like moving forward, right? We do have test and Atomic Red Team, and I'll let you run this, but at least they've been there, and you're able to, we looked a little bit at the red team side or the attacker side about what they're doing and how AMSI works and whatnot, and definitely play with some of those frameworks just to see how they operate and how they bypass AMSI. And then here, I'll let you, Jenny, you can run these next ones, and how to go off and run it with Atomic and detect it from there.
Yeah. So, this is one of the ones I decided would be useful to push into Art. It's very popular. So this technique, Matt Graber discovered, and I think he famously tweeted like, look, AMSI bypass in one tweet, right? I think that's kind of cute. But this one is neat because it's built into PowerShell Empire, and it's built into other like Posh C2 and stuff like that. And essentially, it's super easy. Like you literally just need to put this in a PowerShell command line, and it will bypass, AMSI inspection. So from an ease of use perspective, if you're an attacker, heck yeah, I can just copy and paste this into my code and it works. From a detection perspective, it's really loud, and we'll get into how you detect these things in a couple of slides. But this one is the patching, right? We're patching the currently loaded DLL in memory in the process, and so there's so PowerShell can natively talk to the .NET CLR, right? The .NET subsystem inside of Windows. And in this specific, you see these references, assembly, get type. So whenever you see these like assemblies, right, you're talking about .NET assemblies. And in this specific one, it's getting the assembly, right, because PowerShell is written in .NET. And so it's getting the assemblies for system.management.automation.amsi utils, right? And so this is a class inside of this .NET assembly that provides, like it's named, AMSI utilities, right? And very specifically, there's one called AMSI init failed. And so essentially when PowerShell loads AMSI, it's looking at this field, and if this field says, hey, I failed to initialize, it doesn't like bomb the whole PowerShell process, right? It continues to run as it should, but it runs in a state where AMSI is no longer inspecting anything that's executed. And so this is just a really quick, like elegant one-liner that sets that AMSI init failed to true by patching the memory in real time, right? And so, I guess we'll talk about the sort of detections in a little bit more. But yeah, if you use the Invoke Atomic Red Team PowerShell script, this is in the T 1089 Atomics folder, YAML. And this one is test 11, right? So that PowerShell script, by the way, is super useful. We use it internally at CB a lot. And so you can just kind of give it its one-liner. One of the nice things about it is you don't have to run every single test. So this specific one is a defensive bypass. And so there are quite a few tests in there. And so if you don't want to run them all and you want to stay true and run an atomic sort of single unit test, you would just say, dash test and then 11, right? Or test number 11, enter. And it would just run this one for you, and you're off to the races. And then when I first put this in, Mike was like, hey, can you clean this stuff up? And I was like, no way. But then I was like, well, let's test this. And so actually, if you just set this back to false, PowerShell is happy, AMSI is happy, and it continues reporting alerts. So it won't ruin your current PowerShell session. That's one thing when you're testing these bypasses. I ran into this a few times. It's like, why isn't this recording anymore? And it's like, oh, that's right. Like 10 steps ago, I bypassed AMSI. Right?
Ruined your tests.
That's right.
At least we have cleanup commands.
That's true. And sort of one other aside is, you notice how the elevation required is false, right?
Yes. Yep.
So this doesn't need admin rights. Remember, we talked about user land, right? And in this specific case, this is running in the context in which it was executed in, right? And so if that was just a regular user and that user was allowed to run PowerShell, then that user could muck with that process, right? And I think it's sort of like a really good example of the user land and how it can be tampered with.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All right, this one's everyone's favorite reg key. And so we touched on this, right? And this is just one of the keys. So I thought this was an important one because it's telemetry that we all should be looking at. This key should never be modified in your environment. And if it is, it's very rare. And from what I've seen, it maybe a Defender updates and things like that, it might update this key, but it's very rare. And so essentially, like I said, in order to have an AMSI provider, whether you're Microsoft or whether you're a third-party vendor, you have to register it at this location in the registry, right? And the GUID itself is just kind of like a stub that points to your, your implementation of AMSI. And all this test is doing, now, yes, it needs admin rights because we're in the HV local machine registry hive, but it's literally just deleting that registry key. And this specific GUID is the one for Windows Defender. And so it's this is very easy, right? Like you can see, it doesn't take, a nation state to look at these things. And to be honest, like these are the types of things that the bad guys are looking for. It's like, perfect, no one's monitoring this registry key. I can just delete this and carry on and spawn a new session and carry on, right?
I think the other piece here that I'm like looking at, I'm like, who's looking for this through PowerShell, right? Like you might be looking for the reg.exe, but how often are we changing that to look for PowerShell modifying the registry? That's pretty good.
Yep, I agree. And then the next two are similar. This one is the DLL. So this is actually a brand new test in Atomic Red Team. There were no DLL search order hijacking tests. So this is, and honestly, this is like a really good example without having to have like any sort of external dependencies as part of the test, right? Which I kind of like when we're using these internally, I like the ones that are kind of just really self-contained and not, having to download anything. And so I described this a little bit in that previous slide, but essentially this is just copying PowerShell into a user writable directory, right? We don't need admin rights to do that. We're also copying that AMSI DLL. The key here, right, if you're an attacker, is you want the architectures to match, right? System32, System32, or sysroute64, sysroute64. And we're putting that right next to that newly named process that is PowerShell. And then we're executing it. And what you're going to see, the key to this one, right, isn't, yeah, you should have indicators for, PowerShell masquerading, which is the next slide. But the key here is generating the telemetry in which you're seeing this AMSI DLL not being loaded from the standard path in which it should be loaded from, right? And that is the definition of DLL, search order hijacking. And Matt Nelson did a really good job in this post here on bypassing AMSI via COM server hijack. And he goes into a lot of detail in how you can bypass an older version's COM server, or you can muck with it via COM to disable AMSI. But at the end of the day, the way in which he was doing it was via the search order hijacking, right? And so that was sort of my inspiration to sort of dig into this a little bit more and develop detections for it.
Yeah, that's an awesome test, and that's pretty much what we're seeing, right? Is they're moving these legitimate Windows applications into, which is funny, I didn't realize you used app data on that, but that's where they're putting them, right?
Oh yeah.
It's so easy. Yep.
Oh yeah, it's everyone's favorite app data. And you would think as a defender, well, I'll just watch for anything put in there. And the reality is it is so noisy and so loud.
Yep. It's all WebEx's fault and TeamViewer.
That's right. And God bless the people that use TeamViewer. God bless them.
Yeah. That should be its own webinar.
And then finally, I think this is it's sort of an homage to the previous one, but to stay true to MITRE's definition of process masquerading T1036, I just sort of wrote this quick test because this also is an easy way to bypass AMSI, and also is a way that I've seen sort of malware also drop its own versions to bypass just generic PowerShell detections, path-based PowerShell detections. And so it's just renaming PowerShell to task host W, right? Which is like the sort of surrogate process that all scheduled tasks in newer Windows operating systems spawn out of. And so this is a sort of just a really quick, easy, simple test, right? That's for defenders to sort of hone their detection engineering, detection, I don't know, signatures, trying to figure out, hey, is this PowerShell and should it be executing out of this directory, right?
Random question, kind of on that same line. If an actor brings in their own compiled PowerShell, will that come with, I'm assuming it'll probably be like a downgraded then at that point, right? Probably version 2. So would it require AMSI?
That's a good question. So PowerShell is open source, right? But I don't know if the older versions of PowerShell are open source. I think it's like six and newer.
Yeah.
And the new versions of PowerShell also need the new .NET, native .NET stuff too, right? Because it can run on Linux, Mac, star NIX, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting one, right? Because I think you could get fancy and compile it, not sign it, right? And also change the binary metadata too, right? And you can get around detections with that. So yeah, that's a tough one. I guess you could use Yara, right? You could use Yara to fingerprint that binary, right? You could go on GitHub and look at strings and things and whatnot. Since it's a .NET binary, they're super easy to decompile and pull that data out of.
Yeah, I've always kind of like pitched an idea of not looking for PowerShell or internal name PowerShell. Look for the command line, just go kind of for it.
Actually, now that we're sort of talking about this, it has to mod load systems.management.automation. Whatever the
PowerShell DLLs.
Yeah. Yep. And so regardless, that would get hooked by AMSI and you would see whatever it's doing.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know, just random, interesting question.
Yeah, no, those are like the kind of things.
Quick thought.
Now we're all.
I know. Everyone's like, wait a minute. Oh, let me go figure this out real quick. See ya.
That's right.
Cool. On to detection.
Yes.
This you got a lot of good stuff here.
Yes. So we're kind of just going. We're flipping and saying, all right, so we started off with the art test around the reflection, right? And the AMSI and it failed. And so I just figured I'd show you, like just using open source tools, what you can see, right? Because I think that first question was a really good one around, hey, is only Defender allowed to see AMSI data? And the reality is, as far as I've seen out there on the interwebs, there isn't like an open source sort of utility you can use to hook the AMSI data and use that. Right, and what I'm thinking I immediately go to is like Sysmon, right, or Procmon. How come those don't natively integrate with AMSI, right? It's a good question. I don't know. But the next best thing, and maybe this is the reason why they're not integrated, is we have script block logging, right? And that was something that was introduced in the Windows Management Framework 5, right, on Windows. And you can manage it with group policy, and you get really great telemetry, pretty much equivalent to what you would see in an AMSI callback or a hook. And the only sort of downside with all of these sort of local logging tools, right, is you got to pipe those logs back somewhere, right? And so it turns more into like an IT problem of like aggregating all the data at scale, storing it, being able to search it, right, and all the money that comes along with that. And so I at least personally, I believe that's probably one of the barriers to entry. Like, yeah, you might have this on your servers, but you don't have this sort of at the more higher risk, endpoints within your company. And then I just sort of show you, like, this is a good comparison. So these are like the raw AMSI event logs that Carbon Black returns. And so we do some other sort of tricky stuff with some of the data, but you can see, you're looking at the line that says info PowerShell, right, and then the reference assembly. You're seeing the same strings, right? And we say it as like it's a string. We also sort of calculate the unique SHA-256 hash related to that, so you can quickly search on it, and then the length of that command, right? That's in my experience, that's been one of the like really generic but sort of really good indicators. Like if typically anything over 300 bytes from a PowerShell execution is going to be evil almost every time. Like it seems like that is the case. But as a defender, right, I want you to ask this question to yourself at the bottom, right? How often do your scripts or do you see PowerShell loading this .NET assembly? And the answer is never, right? There is no need for any IT person or third party software manufacturer to interfere with this specific assembly. And so what you'll see, right, it's the quintessential mousetrap type thing, where building the better mousetrap because the mouse changes. But what the bad guys will do is they'll sort of chunk the systems.management AMSI utils string up into like other strings. They'll base 64 encode it, decode it, whatever, right? But again, when they're doing that, they're giving other tells. There's only so many ways you can do that, right?
Yeah, you've already encoded, right? And you should already be kind of alerting or even looking at the decoded piece of what they're doing. And
you got it. Yep.
So script block logging output here at the top. And so this looks pretty raw and verbose.
Yes, it is. Right. And that's sort of, it's great that telemetry is there, right? It's just using that at scale to your advantage as a defender is a really hard problem.
Yeah. And this would dump everything then, pretty similar to AMSI. Yeah.
Yeah, from my experience and playing around with it and using it in a previous life, yeah, it's darn good. Right. So we use this. We had to set up, we would go in, we would set the group policies in a network. We would have an elk stack and use like nxlog or winlog beat to forward these logs up to an elk stack, and then we would have specific queries that could allow us to quickly identify. Like you can do like frequency analysis of how often PowerShell executes your environment and all that stuff, and then this sort of gives you that added enrichment of, all right, PowerShell ran, what exactly did it do, right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a good option then to get this raw data.
Yeah, I agree. That, as far as I've seen, is like pretty much the only sort of built-in thing in Windows to do it outside of AMSI and paying for a third party to do it.
Got it. Yeah. Ooh. Okay.
All right.
Registry.
Everyone's favorite registry delete, right? So here we are, running the atomic test, and you can see that script block logging. You see it right away, right? Again, it's great telemetry, like we were saying. And I just wanted to put a quick screenshot here from Carbon Black, just showing you, if you have the ability in your environment to monitor registry keys, right? Integrity monitoring of these keys is invaluable. It's one of my favorite things to use for detections. And just right here, we're clearly showing that key was deleted, right? And so, ask you as a defender when you're developing these detections, right? It's like, hey, how often does this key get deleted in my environment? Answer: never. It'll get updated, right? But it will not be deleted.
Yep.
And then these last two questions sort of drive this point home, is like, how come this can even be deleted in the first place, right? Why is this key not tamper protected, right? As an AV vendor, they have the advantage of running in the kernel. And when you're running in the kernel, you can filter calls to specific registry keys, right? And so this is a key regardless of, so if you go on your environment today and you go to this key, if you are paying for a product that has anti-malware scanning interface integrations, you would see a key here. Just see if you can delete it. If you can, submit a ticket with your security vendor to say, hey, can you please tamper protect this key, right? That would be a good one.
It's awesome.
And I think this is really the sort of last detection, and it ties together the masquerading and the DLL hijacking. And I threw in a screenshot here of both Sysmon I'm a big fan of sysmon, and just script block logging to sort of understand the limitations, right? And so we see here that this application, app data roaming updater.exe ran, and we see that it does have a PowerShell version of 5.1, right? So for anything to populate this log, it must have been PowerShell, right? But that's all we really know about this. We don't know, well, I guess we know the path, right? Which is good in the versions. But so you're sort of getting the equivalent, I guess, out of the sysmon piece. The sysmon piece is nice because you can sort of build higher fidelity detections from it because you're getting the binary metadata, right? That binary metadata is really important when you're running this attack and how you can build detections for it, because it will always be there, right? And it sort of allows you to say, one of the easy detections is like, if the process name is not PowerShell.exe, but the internal name says it's PowerShell, right? Boom, you're catching anything that runs that is PowerShell, not named the PowerShell, right? But you can also see with the sysmon logging, the directories that it ran out of, the command line that was there, and all that good stuff, right? And that is super important in terms of detecting the masquerading piece of this, right? And I think as a defender, you should have these masquerading detections in your environment for any of the sort of popular command line interpreters, whether it's CMD, CScript, PowerShell, WScript, MSHTA, right? All those things should have this type of detection in place. And then I also threw a screenshot in here just showing you the module load, the DLL module load of AMSI.dll in the path, right? And so it's another, sysmon also gives you this ability to monitor module loads. And so, right, as a defender, there's sort of two key detections here is PowerShell should only ever be executing out of the directories you see below. And there's a lot of research I put in here. And these are, in fact, the only directories that you should legitimately see PowerShell executing out of. Now, before you go, no, Jimmy, that's not true. What you will see is, what I've seen is people will put these PowerShell in your sysvol or your net logon share on your domain controller, and that just makes my mind explode. That you're just making it so easy for bad. One of the first things bad guys do is they enumerate those shares because they're globally readable by anybody with Active Directory credentials, right? And they're going to go, oh, PowerShell is in the syslog volume? Perfect. That means they're using this for IT-related tasks. I'm just going to use that to do all my evil stuff, right? And so if you see that in your environment, it's time to have a heart-to-heart with the IT folks, right? Or at least like monitor that activity, right? The other one,
something that interests me more is looking for the AMSI DLL, right? Just kind of be loading from random places, and,
yes,
and why, and if it's, I just can't imagine just how interesting it could get, right? If you never looked for it before, didn't really know about it, but after this, you're gonna go wander off. You might find it in an odd place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one to me is I would consider this 100% detection of evil. Yeah. This should never, ever, ever happen. Not even like IT related stuff, right? And so as someone that develops detections and stuff, and I'm sure, Mike, you can relate to this, is like, these are the ones you dream of where it's like, oh, I can just run this and it's 100% fidelity. Yes, thank you. Right. These are few and far between.
It's that good tripwire,
right.
You got the good one going for once. Yeah. This moves, gets dropped elsewhere. I can at least figure something out.
Yep. 100%.
I was even thinking too, like, it's, if you're using sysmon, I was thinking, if you're using sysmon and you're using either like Swift's config or Olaf's config, this would be, the AMSI DLL would be one you want to make sure your config is set up to even log, right? Because mod loads, I think a lot of configs are not collecting mod loads on sysmon. So that's something you would definitely want to go and check. Because I think either the paths would be removed or the AMSI DLL piece would be missing entirely. I'd have to check, but that's something to think about, at least on the mod load side for sysmon.
Yeah, 100%. Agree with that. Yeah, and recording mod loads at scale is hard, right?
Yeah.
Everybody loads them, right?
With PowerShell is like 60 to 80 each time you load
Yes,
it, right?
that's right. That's right.
It's chaos every time.
Yeah, and that's sort of like what we were hinting at when like this is the perfect tripwire, because when you're like, oh well, I'll just do it when PowerShell loads weird DLLs. Well, the reality is it always loads weird DLLs, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that's good. We got one more on this one.
I think.
Oh,
That's
gosh,
it.
we hit it. Yeah, man. Thanks, Jimmy. That was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, if any other further questions anybody has, feel free to reach out to Red Canary here, research@redcanary.com. All of our past Atomic Fridays are on atomicredteam.com. That takes you to our main Atomic page. And what else do we have? Yeah, if you want to check out any of these tests that Jimmy's described, or and whatnot, any of the frameworks, we'll have this posted probably today or Monday, or even probably rest into today. We'll have this video posted. Definitely contribute if you have any other ideas, and if you want to modify or change any of the tests that have been contributed, do it and submit it as a new test, because all of that just helps everybody in the community learn and figure these things out too. And like I think one I told you, Jimmy, was just the other day too, is like, why don't we, in the search order hijack ones, I think, just, or even just like we talked about earlier, just copy different ones and move them to the app data and see if you have coverage for it, rename
That's
it,
right.
masquerade it, and see if you have coverage for it. And while you're at it, submit a new test, because those all just help everybody learn, what we have coverage for, what we don't have coverage for. And that might be a really interesting bypass for AV, right? Like if you got this solid AV project going, move PowerShell to app data and execute something and see what happens. Maybe you have coverage for it, maybe you don't. Things are interesting.
Yeah,
You're modifying that registry key for AMSI, right? Like if your AV vendor is not monitoring Camper on it, are they at least, or another product you're looking at, do they at least have coverage for someone modifying that key or values and whatnot?
Yeah. And the renaming binaries is a very interesting one. If you put your bad guy hat on, that is a technique that works pretty well against a lot of sort of protection type technologies on the endpoint.
Yeah, I'm always surprised when you look at like this, like the node thing we looked at the beginning, right? Like it's so noisy, but it's like, imagine if you had just renamed MSHTA or moved in and renamed it. It could be like almost a different story in a way that you could tell in renaming different things, even just your scheduled task, right? Just naming it Microsoft Update 2.0.
That's right.
How much gets by?
Agree.
All other topics. So yeah, we'll open it up. Anybody has any questions? Go from there. And yeah, thank you everybody for joining. We'll have this out later today. But yeah, good times, man. Thank you, Jimmy, for joining too.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for asking me to come on here and share some of this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for all the research on that and submitting some new tests.
Absolutely. Like I told you, we're in this boat together, right? So
yeah. Yep. Yeah, the more we can help,
as a community, right? It's the only thing we can do.
Yeah, and that's the cool part, right? Some of these things they could be extremely advanced, especially when you start getting into the frameworks that are using these techniques. And if you can at least get some of like if you run some of the basic AMSI tests, or even just copying AMSI DLL, or and just playing with those things, it really just helps with understanding these pieces and what may be coming down the road too. Like you may not see a lot of it today, but it may be something that might be coming tomorrow.
Exactly. It's the name of the game, right? Proactive.
Yeah. 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 I know. Who would have thought? Atomic Red Team.
Exactly. That'd be a neat stat to show if you were to correlate sort of whatever the next thing that makes the news, and to see if there are atomic tests that overlap with that, right? Like, I know you guys have some of that with like the chain reactions and things, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I know Carrie. So Carrie's been working on with the Invoke Atomic to chain, just different pieces that
Oh,
way,
heck yeah.
changing the game as far as how chain reactions work. Like, as opposed to a batch file, like let's use Invoke Atomic to run 5 different tests.
That'll be neat.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to add in. I know we're really random here, but add in like PowerShell remoting with Invoke Atomic. I think that'd be great. That would be your lateral movement piece for the day.
Built into a lot of, testing the attack frameworks and things. And, it's something that I think I think from CB perspective, we don't see it very often. But when it's used very prevalent, right? Because environments sort of have to be set up for it already in a way, right? But if it's set up, it's usually set up poorly, where anyone can connect, right? It's that 000/0 rule.
Yeah. Good times.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well,
All right.
we'll end it there. Thank you everybody for joining, and hope you have a great weekend. We'll catch up and chat soon.
Thanks, everybody. Happy Friday.
See you guys. Have fun.